vertiente más puramente filosófica, en la que sobre todo se ha destacado como continuador, si se quiere, y refraseador de la tradición de la alemana, sobre todo de la Escuela de Frankfurt, del pensamiento de Adorno y de Benjamin. Quizá algunos de ustedes ya conocen esa faceta. Y más recientemente su trayectoria se ha acercado de manera muy directa al arte contemporáneo. Creo que su gran virtud como filósofo es acercarse al arte contemporáneo tomando en cuenta lo que el arte contemporáneo de hecho es decir, sin pretender hacer que el arte sea una especie de objeto especulativo. Con mucha frecuencia vemos que los filósofos hablan del arte sin hablar de ninguna obra en particular, sin hablar de ningún artista en particular. Entonces hacen toda una serie de aseveraciones respecto al arte que cuando se enfrentan directamente a la producción que vemos en nuestros museos, parece que estuvieran hablando de otra cosa. Lo que creo que él ha tratado de hacer es algo bastante difícil, que es aunar un discurso filosófico, si queréis, de corte o por lo menos de origen idealista, con una producción artística contemporánea bastante material. Y en ese impasse yo creo que han salido chispas bastante productivas. No me voy a extender mucho porque lo bueno es que se extienda a él. Como saben, esta sesión versará más directamente sobre el problema de la crítica, que puede ser crítica hoy, y la siguiente sobre el problema de lo nuevo. Tendremos bastante tiempo al final para hacer preguntas, y Peter me decía antes también que le gustaría, si os sentís inclinados, que interrumpierais también en mitad de su conversación si hay algo que no entendéis o algo que os parezca particularmente problemático. Con lo cual le doy paso. Su currículum lo tenéis en el folleto, o sea que ya les quedará constancia que es un señor muy respetable. Y nos vemos después de nuevo en las preguntas. So that they can interrupt you if they want.
Good, yeah. Yeah, do interrupt me as I go along, because it'll work better that way, maybe. So I'm not going to read you a text. I'm going to talk through some main points. I think it'll be easier to understand and also easier for you to ask questions if I don't read a formal text. Yeah. So I'm going to talk about basically four things. I'm not going to talk about the example. I'll come to the example at the end, but I'm not going to talk about it. So basically, the first four of these are what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to try and start in a relatively more straightforward way and perhaps get slightly more complicated as it goes on. And you can, at the point at which it starts to become unintelligible, you can raise your hands and signal the traditional sign for drowning. Okay, to begin with some perhaps fairly obvious remarks about the state of art criticism today. Three things really. The main thing of note, if one reads all, and it really is quite a lot that's been written about the so-called crisis of art criticism since the 1970s. The one thing that everybody who writes about criticism, well, actually, there's two things that everybody who writes about criticism agrees about. The first is that criticism is in crisis. The second tends to be that there is no serious criticism left, apart from the criticism being written by the people who are saying that it's in crisis. But since everyone agrees that it's in crisis and that there is no criticism other than their own, it turns out that there's actually quite a lot. But there's basically two different kinds of narratives that you find in this literature about the so-called crisis of criticism. There's what I want to call a narrative of decline, which is like a narrative form which is, well, in some ways, the prevalent historical narrative that you find about culture in Europe and North America for about 150 years, which is, if you like, the narrative of the passing of some cultural golden age or the passing of some artistic golden age. And in the case of criticism, it's the passing of a critical golden age, which generally is understood to run from somewhere around the mid to late 19th century up until the 1960s, at which point it's taken to have entered this so-called crisis. But these narratives, people who interpret crisis in terms of decline, in terms of this very traditional conservative narrative of decline, there's both left-wing and right-wing versions of this this narrative of decline. The right-wing version is in a way the standard version of narratives of decline about culture, which tends to be a narrative of the loss of tradition, understood as the loss of public intellectual communities. So the narrative of the decline of criticism in its conventional conservative form is very tied up with the narrative about the end of intellectuals, particularly in America since the 1950s. Narratives about the end of intellectuals, the collapse of public intellectual life, and its replacement by specialization, professionalization, academic specialisms in particular, is a dominant feature. And a lot of the discourse about the crisis of criticism is just a playing out of this standard narrative genre of cultural decline, in the particular case of art criticism. The left-wing version of the narrative decline is slightly different. The left-wing version is not really so much a narrative of the loss of tradition, but is more to do with the replacement of the public critical function by a pure market relation. So that the standard version of the left-wing story of the crisis of criticism as a narrative of decline is essentially that critics used to mediate the market, right? In other words, judgments of value by critics through their relations with dealers, art journals, and public institutions essentially used to regulate the market, and that the social power of critics was a kind of capacity to translate intellectual authority into market judgment. That's, if you like, the classic role of the critic in many ways within the bourgeois public realm. What happens to the art market after the 60s is that it essentially starts to function in a much more direct way. And according to this left-wing version of the crisis of criticism as a narrative of decline, which I suppose to a certain extent I agree with, the market started to function without the need for critical mediation. In other words, collectors, the relation between collectors, dealers, and artists became direct. It didn't need critical mediation. And in fact, critical mediation was a block to the market. Critical mediation was a block to the market because critics were always coming out with negative judgments about work, which translates essentially into a kind of market barrier, right? So within this model, criticism appears as a kind of barrier to the free flow of the market, because if negative judgment affects exchange relations, then people can't sell so much art, right? So if the market is to function according to its neoclassical ideal, the preference of consumers must be left alone and not disturbed by them feeling guilty about the fact that critics tell them that they might be buying bad art, essentially. Okay, so on this model, the critic has become socially displaced and has lost social power, if not intellectual authority, because the social power is essentially economic power. And I think there's certainly a sense in which that's true. One of the things that's happened as a consequence of this declining, mediating economic role of the critic is the kind of retreat of the critic to academia. And that's the other prevalent motif in a lot of the literature about the crisis and the decline of criticism is the idea that once the art world system had no need for critics mediating markets, critics who might produce negative judgments, put it that way, critics couldn't, if you like, make their way economically in the market anymore. And so they had to go and work in academia. And as soon as they start working in academia, if you like, they're addressing different audiences. And so their public mediating function is progressively being eroded because the forms of legitimation that they need in order to sustain their critical discourse is quite different from the kinds of modes of public address that critics had in the so-called Golden Age. And in America, the kind of classic, always quoted classic case of this move from a journalistic market mediating criticism to an essentially academic mode of criticism, which becomes increasingly intellectually high-flown and becomes, if you like, alienated to a certain extent from the discourses of the art world itself, is the move basically from Art Forum to October, really. It's the Art Forum of the 60s versus the October of the 80s, really. That's the kind of archetypal contrast through which this narrative is mainly sustained in the American context. So there are, as I say, two versions of the crisis narrative as a narrative of decline. There's the right-wing one, which is really to do with tradition and communities and public function, and there's the left-wing one, which is essentially about markets. It should be said that more recently, people have got fed up with, in some sense, the repetitive structure of this narrative of the crisis of criticism as a form of decline, to the point at which a number of different versions of a new theme has really been emerging over the last 5 or 10 years, which is an attempt to escape this, the kind of inevitability of this relentless narrative of crisis and decline about criticism, and to essentially be upbeat about the kinds of changes that have happened to intellectual discourse in the art world, and to try and think positively about them. And there's basically two versions of this, but they both, in a way, revolve around the same concept, which is this notion of a refunctioning of criticism under changed social and economic conditions. And both of them, in many ways, use this concept of the knowledge economy as their way for, if you like, finding a new place and positive role for art criticism within a more directly market-mediated art world. One is essentially simply a positive version of the negative story about markets. In other words, it takes on the same narrative as of the replacement of intellectual mediation by pure market relations, but treats it as a historical inevitability, and that essentially people should stop moaning about it. And the basic term under which this version of the discourse goes is essentially complicity. Joanna Drucker, who wrote quite a good book on theories of modernism, recently wrote a book about complicity, in which complicity is to be understood as, if you like, something which has to be embraced, right? A kind of acknowledgement, a kind of an acceptance of the marketization of intellectual relations, and a kind of appeal to critics to, if you like, make their way within the new knowledge economy by adopting different modes of writing in order to, if you like, retain a critical discourse, but one which, if you like, avoids its role of blocking the market. In other words, one that avoids negative judgments. In other words, to in some sense become kind of neo-feudal functionaries of the market, if you like, from that point of view. Again, there's the attempt to give this positive market economy, knowledge economy version of criticism, the refunction of criticism, a more left-wing stance, and you find this in someone like the second generation October critic George Baker, for example, who wants to essentially embrace this role in a more Nietzschean manner. In other words, and what Joanna Drucker calls complicity, he calls affirmation, which allows this to be simultaneously joyful and allegedly more philosophically respectable. However, in a way, the historical narrative of criticism goes full circle by the time, in this recent piece by George Baker called Late Criticism, one ends up with the idea of criticism as affirmation, which is he presents, via a quotation from Deleuze's book on cinema, as a kind of Nietzschean, Deleuzean affirmative criticism, because essentially one of the things that's being rediscovered in this move to, if you like, a less negative view of criticism's relation to the work is in many ways like a belated and theoretically refigured form of something that a certain sort of criticism always was from the beginning, which is really appreciation. And so at the end of the day, when you're looking at some of these new discourses about refunctioning and affirmation and complicity, what you essentially seem to be doing is returning to a discourse of appreciation from, if you like, the philosophically higher level standpoint of the mediation of criticism passing through the academy. That's essentially one of the things that's gone on. But the basic critical issue, if you like, that's at stake in each of the positions in this ongoing debate is this is my third point here, which is really a quite a strong opposition between those who think criticism is necessarily about judgment and people who think criticism should be about explication. And a lot of the early discourse about the crisis of criticism was in terms of the decline of judgment, and a lot of the justifications of post-critical discourse tended to be in terms of, if you like, the value of a movement from judgment to explication. And so if one wants to go a little bit deeper into the kinds of intellectual models of criticism that are underlying this historical debate over the last 30 years, you need to look at the different models of criticism that are underlying those three things. And essentially, historically, there are three broad philosophical models of criticism that are underlying these debates and returning in different forms, in different varieties and different forms. And essentially, until there's some resolution in some way of the relation between these models of criticism, this debate, I think, will continue to generate itself and repeat itself in a partly cyclical way. So I'm just going to say something briefly about these three broad models of criticism. I suppose the first one is the commonsensical one, the one that is generally associated with judgment, and which is, in its everyday form, primarily associated with negative judgment. Right? In principle, there's not actually any real reason for associating criticism with negative judgments rather than positive judgments, insofar as, if you like, it's judgment which is the category across across that binary. But traditionally, criticism has been associated with negative judgment, and hence has a kind of popular image of being destructive in some ways, and has often, of course, been embraced in the avant-garde and modernist traditions precisely because of its destructive power. In a way, in the modernist tradition, it is criticism's capacity to destroy which is its basic historical value. Insofar as positive judgments reproduce what is, only negative judgments have any real creative power, because only negative judgments destroy. As Walter Benjamin famously said, destruction is the condition of possibility of construction. In that sense, historically, the productive role of criticism, in the sense of criticism's role as clearing a ground for new productions, is very much associated with its destructive capacity and a valorization of its destructive capacity. Indeed, a valorization of precisely that which is considered popularly most problematic about it, namely that it's destructive. But it's important to remember the other, if you like, more conservative, traditional side of criticism, the positive judgment and the notion of appreciation, because it's out of positive judgments and the notion of appreciation that canons are formed, and the capacity of criticism to affect intellectual discourses and art production in the medium to long term is dependent upon canon formation. And whereas negative criticism, destruction, can destroy canons and clear them away, there's always, if you like, a necessary element of positivity. And it's this notion of positivity which is coming back, particularly at the moment in this sort of post-Nietzschean, post-Deleuzian guise, as affirmation. So affirmation, you have to bear in mind, affirmation is the theoretically respectable term for appreciation. We can come back to this distinction later. In relation to art judgment in particular, these are general models of criticism applied to art. They're not restricted to art judgments. But insofar as historically criticism has been associated with judgment, it's primarily been associated with aesthetic judgment. And this is very important because it's in the reduction of criticism to aesthetic judgment, that is to say, aesthetic judgments of works of art, that an enormous amount, if you like, of prejudgment, of pre-structuring of those judgments takes place. Because what's assumed, if you define criticism in terms of aesthetic judgment, is that art criticism is essentially judging art as aesthetic art. Okay, and that's the main tradition, at least the main late 19th century tradition that ran through until the 1960s. We can call it the aesthetic tradition, you can call it modernism as an aesthetic tradition, you can call it formalism. But that tradition is constituted by this presupposition that criticism is about judgment and criticism about art is aesthetic judgment. And insofar as that's the case, then what's at stake in terms of this first concept of criticism is essentially a peculiar and rarefied intellectual form of pleasure. That is to say, aesthetic in its traditional Kantian sense as a reflective judgment. That's to say, a judgment of feeling, but not a judgment of sensation, essentially. So the first concept of criticism constitutes, in the art context, an aesthetic tradition, and it presupposes that essentially art is about pleasure, albeit a rarefied and peculiarly intellectual form of pleasure, which, on closer examination, turns out to be little more than your pleasure in your relation to yourself. We don't need to talk about that in detail, but essentially the structure of an aesthetic judgment is the pleasure you take in the experience of the relationship between the elements of your own subjectivity. This is why this is, if you like, the mainstream of a liberal tradition of individuality. Art is the place where you find out essentially something deeper about your relation to yourself on this tradition. Okay, I take it that that's in a way this is the most straightforward, because the most commonplace concept of criticism in many ways. The second concept, which I'm associating philosophically with Kant as well as the first one, but in a rather different way, comes from a different side of Kant's philosophy. This is a concept of criticism more associated with explication than judgment, which is really a model of criticism where the function of criticism is to establish the conditions of intelligibility of a work. Right? The function of criticism is to establish the conditions of intelligibility of a work, and the conditions of intelligibility are taken to be the conditions of its possibility. Yeah. So essentially, this is a much more educative notion of criticism. It's a notion of criticism which is much more closely tied historically to art history than it is to criticism in its journalistic role of making qualitative judgments. And it's the model which reasserted itself in new ways in the 1970s and 80s when the aesthetic model ran aground in the face of the art of the 60s. Essentially, historically, the aesthetic model of criticism as judgments of taste didn't decline for intellectual reasons, so much as it simply ran into a multiplicity of increasingly dominant forms of art in which it was unable to, if you like, find value. And consequently, because of the increasing institutional and social dominance of those forms of art, was, if you like, rendered redundant, historically redundant. So, in the face of that redundancy, you get a re-establishment of this more, if you like, explicative model of criticism as the establishment of the conditions of possibility of the work understood as also the establishment of the conditions of its intelligibility. So at the point at which art ceases to be aesthetic, primarily in its primary determinations, in other words, at the point at which artists become less interested in giving you occasions to reflect on the structure of your own subjectivity and more interested in doing other things with art, is the point at which historically art becomes, if you like, difficult, inverted commas, right? It's the point at which the media of the public sphere start to complain about its unintelligibility and its consequently its alleged elitism on the basis of being unintelligible. Although the people who are unable to understand it tend primarily to be the elite, so it's a slightly odd accusation, but because they're the people who are still buying the big paintings, right? Okay. They're not the people who are really interested in this art. But at the point at which art ceases to be primarily about pleasure and becomes about a variety, a complex multiplicity of other things, then there's, if you like, there's a new function for what we can call, if not criticism, at least critical discourse about art, which is explication or the establishment of the conditions. Yeah. And this is very important because this is the point institutionally at which, when criticism ceases to be journalistic and mediating the market and becomes more academic, it's also the point at which writing about contemporary art begins to be a legitimate object for art historians. So this is the point really in the 1980s in which art history and critical discourses start to converge. And essentially one of the things that happens if we take this emblematic move from an institution like Art Forum to an institution like October in terms of journals, it's the point at which a new generation of art historians carve out a space which is completely new institutionally in many ways, which is the art history of contemporary art. And this thing called the art history of contemporary art, which is this discourse, this critical discourse of explication, which is establishing the conditions of intelligibility of new works, this art history of contemporary art essentially functionally displaces criticism. So what used to be a critical discourse in the sense of a discourse of judgment becomes a discourse which is, if you like, tries to be immediately historicizing. Yeah. I mean, it's actually, one forgets quite what a recent phenomenon it is for art historians to be allowed, to write about post-war art, right? Even in the 1980s, most people who studied art history in European institutions, were lucky if they got to the end of the 19th century, right? Because history was understood to begin quite a long time ago. It was really only in the 90s when, partly on the back of a cultural fashion for relatively speedy recycling of recent fashions, that the 1960s became a possible object for art historians. And it really was quite a big deal when art historians started writing about the 60s. And there still are serious issues, and some people disagree with it completely, as the sense in which and the way in which it's possible to constitute a properly historical discourse about the 1960s, let alone the 1970s or the 1980s, let alone the 1990s. Yeah. But certainly the way in which people we might call as the second generation October group, the students of the people who set up October, Krause's students, Buchlo's students, when they came to make their way in the world as art writers of various forms, they essentially came to make their way in the world as critical historians of contemporary art. And it's a sort of new genre. It has its own publisher, MIT, and it even comes in a particular font. So it's culturally quite specific. Now, philosophically, this more what I'm calling more explicative notion of criticism, of establishing the conditions of intelligibility of a work, comes in two forms. One of which is taken to be completely outdated, but I suspect is not. The standard form is a Kantian form, and it's a Kantian form because it's serial, and essentially it's Kantian because what it means to establish the conditions of intelligibility of something on this Kantian model is to take an individual work and to ask the questions of its conditions of intelligibility, and then to take another work and to ask the question of its intelligibility, but not to try to conceptually integrate necessarily the accounts of the conditions of possibility of any particular work. Right? So just as contemporary art itself primarily gains its unities at the level of series, right, rather than in other logically possible forms of unity, particularly organic unities, insofar as modern art is essentially serial, this kind of criticism is basically essentially serial as well. And it means that you can kind of divide up artists and works between critical historians of contemporary art, and they don't necessarily impinge on each other. So if you write about Smithson, then you write about Smithson, and if you write about Dan Graham, you write about Dan Graham. So there's a kind of regionalization, there's a kind of, you get your own patch, and it's sort of understood that broadly speaking, whatever you say about Smithson isn't really going to affect what the other guy is saying about Dan Graham. As long as what he says about Dan Graham doesn't really affect what you say about Smithson, then essentially you're operating with a serial model here, a serial Kantian model of conditions of intelligibility, which has as its basic presupposition, and this is the basic Kantian presupposition, that works can gain their intelligibility independently of each other, broadly speaking, or if not necessarily independently of each other, independently of any works which do not belong to the series of the particular work in question. Yeah. In other words, it presumes that it really is possible to understand, I don't know why I'm stuck on these examples, Robert Smithson, I need to think of a new artist. And someone else can understand Hannah Darboven, right? But that you don't have to understand, in particular, you don't have to understand art which doesn't impinge on the immediate conditions of production of the work you're interested in. Yeah? You only understand art, the only relevant art to understanding a particular work is work that impinges on the immediate conditions of production. The second position, the second unfashionable, problematic position, the Hegelian position, is the view that you only understand any individual work by virtue of its relation to the totality of works. Right? This is, if you like, the traditional totalizing Hegelian position, which would methodologically, and in a sense methodologically tragically, insist that essentially, broadly speaking, you have to understand something about everything before you can really understand anything. Right? That's the traditional Hegelian position. So that there's two models of that, but the Hegelian model is broadly speaking out of fashion because seemingly incompatible with the division of academic labor. Yeah. People tended to think, erroneously, but for the wrong reasons, that Hegel was probably the last person who could try and write about everything, because if you like, there wasn't so much knowledge around in the world in the early 19th century, if you were German. And so in some sense, the projection of a totalizing understanding had some minor empirical plausibility. Nonetheless, there is a serious philosophical issue about the relation between these two positions, which is really whether the horizon of possibility of a more totalizing explanation remains open, or whether, if you like, the methodological self-sufficiency of serial understanding is really adequate. But the main difference, as I say, between the first and the second of these two models is that whereas the first is essentially about pleasure, the second is essentially about meaning. Yeah. So these are strongly different conceptions of what the basic cultural function of art is, essentially. Yeah. Is art to produce within you a reflective pleasure in the elements between your own subjectivity, or is it essentially about meaning and intelligibility, and in particularly, much like literature in its modernist tradition, is it about difficulty in interpretation? Yeah. Which is a completely different model of like which elements of your subjectivity are engaged by art. The third model I want to look at is the one I'm going to talk out a bit more. Is a model that was out of fashion for a very long time, partly because of its association with Romanticism more generally, Romanticism in its bad popular sense, but also because of its association with the same reason that the Hegelian model is culturally unfashionable, which is because of its more grandly metaphysical pretensions, essentially. Is the model that I'm going to call the early Romantic model, and it's the model that I'm going to take Benjamin's kind of schematic reconstruction of as the basis for reasons of simplicity, really. And if the first model is about pleasure and the second model is about meaning, the third model is about truth, truth understood in a metaphysical way. And insofar as the third model is about truth, the third model, if it's to function effectively, would have to incorporate as aspects elements of the first two models. In other words, anything that's about truth has to also be in part about pleasure and meaning. Insofar as pleasure and meaning are aspects, of truth. Yeah. So the apparently serially ordering of these three concepts is not innocent insofar as the third one has a kind of hierarchical relationship to the first two. And furthermore, the third one has a close relationship to the Hegelian version of the second one, insofar as, like the Hegelian version, it essentially associates truth with totality or systematicity. What's different between the two models is the relation to totality or systematicity. And it's that relation which, if you like, makes romantic criticism so distinctive. And what I'm going to just do is try and say something very briefly and very general about this romantic model of criticism. And this is where it might get slightly more complicated. But I will simplify ruthlessly on your behalf. So I'll just talk through some of these basic concepts of the romantic model. And then I'll go on to make the main claim, the main and slightly eccentric claim, which is that it's only the romantic model which allows us to understand the conceptual character of contemporary art as a constitutively post-conceptual kind of art. But I'm not going to spend too much time on these concepts, because I think it's better if you ask me questions about them than if I try and explicate them at length. But essentially, the difference between the Hegelian model and this romantic model is an inversion in the relation between part and whole. Yeah. To cut it down to its simplest. In other words, if the Hegelian model is a model of explanation which insists that to understand anything you must understand it as the part of a whole, in other words, you understand it in the totality of its relationship to all other parts. That's what it means to understand something as the part of a whole. The romantic model, because of its essentially Kantian qualifications about understanding wholes, it agrees with Kant that you can't understand the whole, right? That the Hegelian, the dream of understanding the part through the whole must fail because you can't understand the whole. Essentially inverts the part-whole relationship and makes the claim, and this is, if you like, the distinctive claim of early Romanticism, which founds the metaphysical concept of art, it founds the concept of literature, it founds the modern concept of criticism. It's a philosophical move that simultaneously grounds a number of deep intellectual traditions. It essentially claims that art is a special kind of object, through which you understand the whole. In other words, a work of art is a part through which you understand the whole. In other words, instead of understanding the part through the whole, you understand the whole in the part. Yeah. That's at its most simple, the ontological claim about art that you find in the Romantic tradition, which in a way grounds the whole Western concept of art implicitly. That is to say, in terms of this first basic concept, art is what's called a medium of reflection of the whole. Yeah. You don't need to go outside the part to the relation to all the other parts to understand the part through the whole. You need to find the whole immanently within the self-reflection of a particular ontologically distinctive kind of part known as the work of art. And the traditional term for this special kind of part, which is the work of art, is the fragment, right? So within this romantic tradition, the work of art is a medium of reflection of the whole in the sense in which it is a fragment. This is very important because the notion of fragmentation has a kind of cyclically recurring role in the history of reflection on art, and at each moment of its recycling, it tends to get claimed. But it's important to remember that the notion of fragmentation isn't just, if you like, there at the beginning of the modern tradition in early Romanticism, but it's actually the notion of fragmentation which philosophically grounds the notion of the work of art. It's quite important because there's a tendency to think of modernism in terms of fragmentation, because by the time of the late 19th century, people have forgotten early Romanticism. And then again in the 1970s, by which time people have actually forgotten what modernism is, they then claim that postmodernism is about fragmentation, right? So each time that the concept of art, the same ontological concept of art is rediscovered, it's rediscovered through the notion of fragmentation, and the claim is made that this is what makes it new. It's postmodern, it's modern, etc. But it's not a contingent feature that can be discovered at any particular historical time, because in terms of this romantic philosophical model, the work of art is a fragment. Okay, so to understand the work of art essentially means philosophically to understand the fragment, and I'm not going to spend too long on this, but essentially the basic point about the concept of a fragment is that a fragment is constituted by a special relationship between its incompletion and its completion. Yeah. That is to say, insofar as a fragment is something which is broken off from something else, it's constitutively incomplete. The first defining characteristic of a fragment is it's constitutively incomplete. It has an incompletion that cannot ever be restored to it without the destruction of its fragmentary status. Yeah. In other words, if you think of the fragment in a literal, physical way, and the interest in sculpture of antiquity is the background to the formation of this concept, insofar as there are very few sculptures of antiquity which are not fragments, in the sense of which are not broken. Yeah, you can't complete a fragment without destroying it, because you'd restore the work. Okay, so the first part of the definition of a fragment is it's constitutively incomplete. However, the second, and in some sense more crucial, the dialectical opposite to the incompletion of the fragment is, despite the fact that the fragment is constitutively incomplete, the fragment also, at the figurative level, has its own kind of wholeness, right? Because it's been separated from that from which it is fragmented. Yeah. And the rest of the thing that makes up a whole is absent. Yeah. All that you have is the fragment. And so the fragment that you have has its own completeness. What you have, yeah, is constitutively incomplete, but figuratively, particularly in a visual way, complete. Indeed, as Schlegel says in the Athenaean fragments, like a hedgehog. The hedgehog is the image of the fragment for the Romantics. The hedgehog is completely central to Romantic epistemology. I won't go into this, but it's essentially a hedgehog epistemology. So the fragment is constitutively incomplete and yet figuratively complete. Doesn't seem to be necessarily so surprising. What's surprising is that the particular relation between the nature of its incompleteness or its finitude and its completeness is what allows it to act as a medium of reflection of the whole. Because the fragment is figuratively complete, it acts, if you like, analogically as an image of the whole. It has an imagistic relation of identity to the whole while being incomplete. And this imagistic wholeness, means that the relation between incompletion and completion, which is the traditional relationship between the work of art and everything else, is internalized to the fragment or to the work of art. Okay? So this is a concept of art in which the relationship, which on the previous model was the relationship between art and everything else, is internalized to the fragment. The fragment stages its own relationship of incompleteness to completeness. But because the wholeness of the fragment is only, if you like, an image of the actual whole, the real whole that it relates to appears only negatively. So that what this means is that philosophically, the fragment allows you to think the whole, but it only allows you to think the whole negatively. And the notion of the image is constituted, if you like, as that form of thought of a negative whole. It's through images that you think wholes negatively in relation to the incompleteness of their parts. Okay? Something like that. Okay, so that's the basic concept of the work that you get in Romanticism. And insofar as there would be a philosophical romantic criticism, it would require that you find a way of treating all works of art according to that model, ontologically, that you find a way of viewing or constructing or reconstructing a work of art in terms of some dialectic of completeness and incompleteness, right? Or which is philosophically some kind of dialectic of finitude or limitation and infinite longing, essentially. So that this incompletion-completion relation is a relation between the level of the subject's relation to themselves, thinking about the earlier model of the subject. It's a model in which the subject experiences themselves simultaneously as finite and limited, but as also infinitely reflective and, in some sense, infinite in its longing for a sense of its own wholeness. So there's a sense in which this is an extension of the Kantian aesthetic tradition because it models the work of art on its relation to the model of a subject, but the subject that corresponds to this kind of model of the experience of work of art has a different structure to the subject of aesthetic judgment or judgments of taste. It's not a subject which is taking pleasure in the unity of the relation between its parts. That's what the aesthetic subject does when it feels beauty. It has an experience of the harmony of the aspects of itself. This is a subject which experiences within itself the contradiction between its finitude and its infinite potentiality. That's really what Romanticism offers you. It's a quasi-tragic structure whereby, if you like, you are the structure of the contradiction between your own finitude and mortal character, and the infinite potentiality that you have for reflection. And the work of art, again, on this model is figuring that for you. So the cultural value of art on this model derives from the fact, just like it does on this Kantian aesthetic one, that it allows you to have this kind of experience of yourself. It's just that it's a completely different kind of experience from the experience of Kantian aesthetic judgment. Yeah, it's a more contradictory experience. It's a more fraught experience, whereas the experience of yourself offered by a Kantian concept of beauty is essentially a reconciled, harmonious one. Okay, so that's the concept of art. So what about the criticism? Well, the model of criticism that goes along with this, I'm not going to go into such detail about this, but basically it's structured around a very important distinction, which I think is conflated more or less systematically in most of the other traditions of criticism as explication. And it's this distinction, which is the third on my list, which is the distinction between commentary and criticism. It makes a strong distinction between commentary and criticism. Most of what passes for critical writing, insofar as there is any criticism in it, is a mixture of commentary and criticism, or a mixture of commentary, criticism, and sort of self-narration, essentially, the self-narration of the experience of the critic. And this distinction between commentary and criticism corresponds to the one above it, to a distinction between material content and truth content. And essentially, what this romantic model does is try to incorporate the empirical art historical moment of explication of a work in terms of the notion of material content as commentary, right, which is essentially the material for criticism, yeah, and then reserves the term criticism for, if you like, the more philosophically reflective moment of the discourse, which attempts to establish the relation to the whole, or attempts to, if you like, find the whole negatively within the individual work, and to establish the truth of the work in terms of that finding of the whole within the individual work. This is the sense in which this model incorporates the more art historical model of criticism as the explication of all establishment of the conditions of intelligibility of the work. And so essentially this offers you a much more developed methodological model, if you like, of what it would be to write criticism. Yeah, the first model, the Kantian model of aesthetic pleasure, doesn't really offer you a discursive model for the writing of criticism. It essentially offers you a model for experiences which you can summarize in judgments of quality. You can say beautiful, not beautiful, but you can't really discursively redeem them because the pleasure is essentially non-discursive. That's the whole point of the aesthetic, right? So famously, Greenberg famously used to talk about what he called the wow factor, right? And essentially, Greenberg thought that the role of a critic was you stood in front of a work of art, generally a painting, or if you're unlucky, a sculpture, and you waited, and you sort of entered into a state of what was traditionally called contemplative immersion. You immersed your subjectivity in the work, and you waited for the wow, right? And if you got the wow, then it was yes, is a work of quality. And if you didn't get the wow, you didn't get the wow. That was it. And essentially what you did when you wrote criticism was you said the show was on in this gallery and it had these works in it, and some of them were red and some of them were green, and they were this size. And you did all that stuff, which was basically what a diminished version of what here is called commentary or material content. And then at the end, you said whether there was a wow or not. Yeah, you basically said yes or no. Yeah, and that's really all that critical discourse essentially boiled down to. On this model, on the explicative model, there's much more discourse because you have to explain the conditions of intelligibility. You don't worry about the wow. You think that the wow is subjective, you don't care if the other person got the wow. Maybe you had a wow and I didn't, or someone else had a wow somewhere else. That's okay, that's all subjective and you can all go and have your wows, but essentially all you're doing when you have your wows is the same thing you're doing when you're consuming any other commodity. Yeah, you're having an experience of pleasure that's not fundamentally, structurally different from other kinds of pleasure. But what you're doing when you're working with art is you're working with something difficult and you're trying to understand it. You're trying to produce meaning from something that presents itself to you as opaque. So what you're doing is you're establishing the conditions of intelligibility. And for that, you need a really big discourse, right? Because you have to reflect on the work and its resistance to meaning and its capacity to generate meaning and how it generates meaning and what kinds of meaning. So the first Kantian pleasure model is, very short pieces which don't really say much other than what was in the room and then wow or not wow. Explicative pieces which you can write literally endlessly in a hermeneutical sense because meaning can be constantly generated. Yeah. You just stop writing in some sense at the point at which you've written enough. And this model, which wants to, if you like, incorporate elements of the explicative approach as material content, but doesn't see, if you like, that discourse achieving what philosophically can be called criticism until you make the move from material content to truth content. And that's the point at which you move from commentary to criticism. And the medium for that is the fourth term on my list, which is systematic referability. And the way that, if you like, you build up to move from commentary to criticism is by producing, if you like, sufficiently systematic a commentary to be able to build up the perspective or the standpoint of the whole. And when the commentary has put you into a position, a position of sufficient systematicity in the way that you're viewing the work, you can make the transition, a kind of gestalt switch, to the standpoint of criticism or truth content, which is essentially, and the basic critical task is to uncover the idea of the work through its form. Yeah. So this truth content is, if you like, operating at the level of the idea. You're looking for the idea of the work in its form, but what's distinctive about the idea of the work is that because the work is a fragment, if you like, its idea will contain a potentiality which goes beyond anything in the commentary or in the material content. This is the sense in which people talk about works transcending their own conditions of intelligibility. The traditional notion that there's something transcendent about art, that art in some sense, that there's something in the experience of an individual work that goes beyond its intelligibility, is associated with this notion of the negative totality, which is implicit in the idea of the work of art. This notion of its infinite potentialization. And insofar as a work has such an element, only insofar as it has such an element, on this model of criticism, does it meet the metaphysical criterion to be a work of art? So this is a very strong concept of criticism because ultimately this kind of criticism is deciding which of all the things that are being called art really is art in a strong critical or metaphysical sense. And there might be very little of it about, right? There's a lot of art in the world, particularly in the last 40 years, right? In the sense of individual pieces of art in a technical or traditional sense. But whether any of it lives up to the idea of art or not is the critical criterion. It might turn out that there's very little art in the world in this sense. So this is one sense in which this romantic model is very contemporary, because the critical crux, or if you like, the critical decision that it makes in each case as a consequence of its attempt to fulfill this model is a distinction between art and non-art, whereas the distinctions in the other models is between good art and bad art, or simple art and difficult art. Yeah. The art non-art distinction, in a way, is the distinction which has replaced the aesthetic distinction of quality. Yeah. And that the philosophical criteria for the art non-art distinction are, if you like, much higher than the good-bad art distinction. Yeah. We can come back to that. Okay. So this capacity to view the work in terms of its idea, that is, and in particular to view it as a fragment, is essentially the capacity to reconstruct the work as a process of infinite becoming. Because of the negativity of the totality that the fragment relates to, the process, if you like, of becoming whole is infinite. So what Novalis calls romanticization is the capacity to produce the experience of a work as a form of infinite becoming. That's what romanticization is. Yeah. And that the basic function of the critic is essentially to romanticize the work in a technical and strictly non-popular sense. Okay. And the negative consequence of the fact that on this model of criticism, the basic critical criteria is between art and not art, instead of being between good and bad art, right, means that you need an additional category, which is the last category, and in some ways the most important category, which is the category of uncriticizability. Because art that doesn't meet the metaphysical criterion of art, critical metaphysical criterion of art, is strictly speaking uncriticizable. In other words, you should just leave it alone. It's not bad art, it's uncriticizable. Yeah. This is a very important category. It's also it's a liberating category, the category of the uncriticizable. It liberates you from the obligation to write endlessly about bad art and say why it's bad, which is like an appallingly Sisyphean task, particularly today. Yeah. If the critic felt that they had to constantly write about everything and say what was wrong with it, it's hopeless. But the category of uncriticizability, in a way, frees you from this Sisyphean task. Okay, they're the basic concepts. I'm going to stop in a minute, yeah? How long have I been going on? Too long? Yeah, okay. I'm going to stop soon. I've forgotten about this slide. Problem, yeah. One of the problems that is standard, or a criticism that is standardly made of this model of criticism, and indeed that is discussed by Benjamin briefly at the end of his essay on the romantic concept of criticism, and in some sense represents a kind of Goethean criticism of romanticism, is that this notion of criticism, which is, if criticism, if it's the judgment of criticism, what is art and not art, then there's a sense in which it is criticism, not art, that is constituting the art status of the work. Right? And if criticism and not art is constituting the art status of the work, then famously in the Romantic conception, which I didn't have at the end of that list, it's criticism which famously completes the work. Yeah, it's the famous notion. Criticism completes the work. No work is in some sense self-sufficient on this model, but philosophically reflective critical discourse completes it. You can't experience the work as a work unless mediated by this kind of philosophically reflective critical discourse. And the problem is, if that's the case, then it looks like criticism has become more important than the work. And it's paradoxical, because it's the criticism which is giving art the art status, not the art. Right? So the standard complaint about Romanticism, and this is perhaps clearer in literary criticism than it is in criticism in the visual arts, but there's an elevation of criticism above the work, and that a certain kind of criticism, and clearly this is a tradition particularly associated with French modernism and philosophically with deconstruction. Right? There's a sense in which criticism becomes the thing, and the work kind of almost drops out. The alleged solution to this problem is to remind yourself that the philosophical reflection on the work, which is being discursively reconstructed by criticism, or discursively constructed by criticism, if it is functioning correctly, is a recovery of a self-reflection which is imminent to the work. Right? So the reason that, if you like, the paradoxical higher evaluation of criticism is in a certain sense an illusion, is that what appears in a discursively autonomous form as criticism, that's to say writing about something else, is actually just the discursive externalization or recovery of the self-reflection of the work. And that, if you like, gives you the ultimate criterion for the success or otherwise of the criticism. Whether you're able to, if you like, re-internalize it to the work. If criticism becomes self-sufficient, if the criticism becomes self-sufficient, in some sense there must be something wrong with it, in the sense that the function of the criticism is supposed to be to return you to the work. And criticism will only complete the work if, in some sense, the structure of reflection which has been constructed critically is taken back and experienced within the work. So while notionally criticism may complete the work, the criterion, the ultimate, if you like, experiential criterion of the validity of the criticism is your capacity to take that back into the work. So, if you like, the higher evaluation of criticism, in some sense, in that respect, is a kind of pseudo-problem, but it does indicate to a certain extent, not so much esoteric, but it indicates that there's an extraordinary amount of intellectual labor which this model requires of you to have an adequate experience of a work of art. Right? This talk is a symptom of that historical difficulty. But I suppose I would argue that, if you like, this is a sense, just as the fact that the judgment is a non-art distinction rather than a good-bad art distinction. Similarly, the fact that this is a critical model which insists that, in some sense, art demands things of you that are different from other forms of experience or consumption of cultural commodities, is again something which actually makes this model more rather than less relevant to contemporary work, in the sense that if you try to have a sort of self-contained experience of contemporary art on a work-by-work basis, you're essentially not going to get much out of it beyond incomprehension and irritation and a number of other traditional experiences. So, what is the basis of my conclusion? I'll conclude here. What is it that about romantic criticism in particular that ties it to the post-conceptual status of contemporary art? I was going to say a few things very quickly about this, then we can have some discussion. The first is that it's through romantic criticism, if you like, that the distinction between the philosophy of art and aesthetics emerges historically. It's a problem, this distinction, insofar as in ordinary language people often use the term aesthetics to mean philosophy of art. But insofar as by aesthetics we mean something like a discourse of the aesthetic, and hence a conception of art as aesthetic art, clearly the romantic model of art as fragment is not an aesthetic, it's not a purely aesthetic model. And it's only if you have a distinction between an ontological concept of art and an aesthetic concept of art that you can make sense of conceptual art. And consequently that you can make sense of post-conceptual art. Insofar as conceptual art is not aesthetic art, then either the concept of aesthetic art is inadequate and restricted, or conceptual art is in principle and by definition not art. But since historically, institutionally, that's not the case, the aesthetic model falls. And if the aesthetic model falls, you need a non-aesthetic philosophical discourse about art. Romanticism gives you that non-immediately aesthetic philosophical discourse about art. This, in a way, relates immediately to the second point, which is the anti-aestheticism of conceptual art, if you like, parallels the non-aesthetic definition of the artwork that you get in the romantic tradition. And I think I'm going to, rather than attempt to explain the sense in which contemporary art is post-conceptual art, which might be to start all over again, I think I'm going to stop and let's have some discussion. Okay. Yeah.
Nuria, traduzco si quieres las preguntas y descansas un poquito. Si quieren, necesitan ir al baño o algo, hacer un pequeño break y volver a las preguntas, o lo hacemos ya todo de corrido. Quizá, si no nos hemos extendido tanto, podemos seguir más o menos de corrido. ¿Hay alguna pregunta que inmediatamente salte desde ahí? ¿No? Pues entonces yo haré la primera, la emito en español y luego se la traduzco, que tendría que ver un poco con unir la primera y la última parte de la charla. Imagino que no estoy sola pensando que empezamos hablando de cosas muy materiales, muy prácticas, muy concretas, y acabamos hablando de cosas que quizás nos resultan un poco más difusas. Para mí la pregunta sería ver cómo este modelo de crítica romántica o crítica romántica temprana se puede recuperar en un contexto institucional como el que describí al principio, es decir, en un contexto en el que el crítico básicamente se ha convertido en una figura como accesoria al mercado o que huye a la academia en departamentos normalmente de historia del arte, etc. Es decir, en un contexto institucional que parece estar bastante poco dirigido a potenciar este modelo crítico, ¿qué futuro tendría un crítico que ejerciera de acuerdo con esa crítica romántica, según la cual posiblemente la mayoría de las veces tuviera que decir la obra no es criticable porque no es criticable porque no cumple ese mínimo de criticabilidad que la convierte en arte, simplemente no es arte, ¿no? O sea, hay algo, digamos, en la relación entre la primera y la última charla, la parte de la charla que me parece crucial, ¿no? Just saying that I think my question would have to be with the relationship between the very early and the very latest bit of the talk. Mm-hmm. So, in a sense, even though you haven't sort of problematized that, I suppose it's implicit in your talk that given the landscape that you described for art criticism, in which, institutionally it is either basically completely, sidestepped, or it's relegated itself to academies in which I suppose they function as one of the art historians or visual culturists, mm-hmm. or whatever they are. So given that status quo, what hope is there for this sort of recuperation of a romantic criticism of art through which most times you might have to sort of not just work as a critic, but as one who says this is not criticizable, and in a way that's, yeah.
Well, the concept of uncriticizability frees you from having to do that, so that gives you more time. Well, I suppose that I think that the story of the regression of criticism, or at least of serious intellectual critical discourse about art to the academy, is a kind of it's a slightly self-fulfilling narrative of decline, because I suppose the question is, how many people are trying to do otherwise? I suppose that's the first point. Most of the important art writing of the 60s was by artists rather than critics, right? That's something else. That's another issue I didn't have time to talk about. But insofar as most of the important writing of the critical writing of the 60s was by artists, and primarily by conceptual artists, it didn't take the work that has retrospectively appeared as the important work didn't necessarily, although it did sometimes, appear in journalistic form. I mean, some of it appeared in Art Forum, but a lot of it appeared in extremely small artist-run magazines. Like a Conchi 0 to 9, or Aspen, or Avalanche, or these artist-run magazines of which they only printed 200 or 300 copies, that weren't widely distributed outside of the art community, but their productive historical function, depended on their internality to the art community. So I don't think that the artistic, social, or historical importance of criticism depends upon it being published in mass market forms of distribution. I think the historical importance of criticism is a relationship between its intellectual qualities and its relation to art production. And I think that most of what current sociology of art calls reception is historically irrelevant. That is to say, if you want a historical criterion of reception, if you ask a sociologist what reception is, they'll do a market survey. They'll tell you how many people saw it or what they thought of it, and they'll do something like Bourdieu. They'll break them down by class, gender, etc., and tell you their views about them. That, to me, that's an art critically irrelevant concept of reception. To me, the only criterion of reception, the only historical criterion of reception of a work, is whether it becomes a necessary condition of the production of another work. Right? That is to say, a work which is not a condition of the production of another work does not enter into art history, however many people see it. Right? And in order to become the condition of production of another work, it has to intellectually engage people who are themselves producing art, which is a condition of more art. So I think that the two criteria are to do with its intellectual qualities and its, if you like, its capacity to place itself within a critical and artistic community, and that doesn't require very much in publishing terms.
¿Hay alguien? ¿Alguna otra?
Lo primero es que me parece que no funciona correctamente el sonido. La traducción última no se ha oído.
¿Es generalizado? ¿O?
Sí.
Vale. Si les parece, entonces, como en cualquier caso estaba... Nuria, si quieres puedo seguir traduciendo yo las preguntas. Sí, ¿vale? Vale. Entonces hago la respuesta. ¿La respuesta que ha dado Peter la han entendido o no se ha escuchado? ¿Según qué aparato? O todo?
No está traducido.
Vale, bien, entonces simplemente la traduzco. No, pero es que pensé que estaba escuchando a Nuria, pero a lo mejor me la he imaginado yo.
Sí, ella ha traducido, pero no se ha oído por los altavoces.
Ah, qué curioso, vale. Okay, no, there's no problem with the translation, but I was going to translate myself anyway, so I'll just... hago una versión reducida de la respuesta y luego pasamos a la siguiente. Bien, yo le preguntaba acerca de esta relación rara entre el hecho de que institucionalmente el crítico parecía haber quedado un poco obsoleto y este modelo de crítica tan duro, quizás, si quieres, que él plantea, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, él decía que este criterio de criticabilidad, el pensar que hay obras que simplemente no hace falta hablar de ellas porque no cuentan como arte, te libera y te da más tiempo, es decir, tienes más tiempo. Mi opinión sería que tienes más tiempo para trabajar en un bar, con lo cual tampoco... Pero en ese sentido te da más tiempo para dedicarte a lo que quieres hacer crítico, ¿no? También decía que hasta cierto punto esta narrativa del declive de la crítica, que se tiene que ir a la academia, etcétera, etcétera, es un poquito como una especie de profecía que se cumple a sí misma. Es decir, que tampoco hay mucha gente que esté tratando de hacer crítica de otra manera. Entonces, hasta cierto punto es como no sabemos hacerlo de otra manera, luego encima... le echamos la culpa a alguna especie de declive más grande que nosotros, ¿no? También apuntaba que en los 60 casi siempre eran los artistas y no los críticos los que escribieron, digamos, los textos que han pasado a considerarse importantes en aquel momento, ¿no? Y estos aparecían en revistas muy pequeñas, autopublicadas, o sea, en contextos, digamos, que no precisaban de ese apoyo institucional, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, su idea es que una crítica, digamos, que tenga una relevancia social, histórica y artística no necesita de estas formas de masivas de distribución. Lo que necesita son unas cualidades intelectuales que ayuden a la producción artística en sí. Es decir, hablaba del concepto de recepción, dice, bueno, si le preguntas a un sociólogo qué es la recepción, te dirá, bueno, te hará un estudio de mercado, pero en lo que concierne a la crítica, una crítica que ha sido bien recibida, si quieres, es aquella crítica que se convierte en una condición necesaria para una producción posterior, es decir, o sea, aquella crítica sin la cual hubiera sido imposible concebir subsecuentes producciones artísticas. Entonces, en ese sentido, tu problema fundamental no es conseguir una revista de gran nombre que te publique, sino conseguir implicar intelectualmente a gente que está en la actualidad produciendo arte.
I'll just say one other thing, actually. In relation to the example, in the book which Sendiak is translating, the book of essays, the work that I use as an example of how to apply this model of criticism is deliberately a work which within the British critical context was the object of the claim that it was a work, if you like, that was that was not it was not possible to criticize, yeah, which is this one by Tracy Emin, right? That's the one. It's called I've Got It All. So that the point is that you have to be, if you like, you have to be able to critically redeem anything you want to make the claim for, but it doesn't have to be the kind of art, if you like, which is considered to be traditionally romantic or conceptual, etc. Yeah.
Ok, sí, bueno, este punto posterior tiene que ver con que en su libro, esto se me olvidó decirlo al principio, pero debería ser lo primero que digo al entrar y al salir, es que Sendeak va a publicar un libro que recoge una serie de ensayos de Peter sobre arte contemporáneo. Queríamos haberlo tenido listo para este seminario con las inundaciones que hemos sufrido en Está, pero estará listo antes de final de mes. Hay algunos textos, para quien le interese también, que están colgados bajo licencia Creative Commons en la página web del Sendeak, por si quieren echar un vistazo un poco a tal. Decía que en su libro, la obra que utiliza para, digamos, hacer una puesta en práctica de este método crítico es una obra, esta de Tracy Emin, I've Got It All, que precisamente ha sido sistemáticamente por la crítica, desde luego por la crítica británica, considerada como no arte, ¿no? O sea, ha sido siempre recibido que es una obra menor o que de alguna manera no está a la altura. Entonces, bueno, lo que dice Peter es que tú tienes que puedes, digamos, aplicar este método a cualquier obra y no necesariamente a una que se conciba como más conceptual o no sé. Pero si lo haces tienes que conseguir redimirla críticamente. ¿You have a question?
Sí, yo quería preguntar, no tengo muy claro si lo he entendido muy bien, por eso quiero preguntar. Sí, debemos entender que el arte y la crítica no pueden existir separadamente, o sea que sin crítica no hay arte, y si cuando se produce esa unión ya no hay cabida para más argumentos. Una vez el arte ha recibido crítica, existe como arte y no antes, y en ese momento ya está, no es bueno o malo, simplemente es arte. Esa es la pregunta, si es lo que yo he entendido.
He was saying that he got the impression you were arguing for a kind of inseparability of art and art criticism, but also that somehow, once that the union has been exerted, so that, the criticism has been affected, the work is declared art, it's almost like there's no longer anything else to say, because the argument would be only for whether it's art or whether it's not art.
All right, yeah, no. Mm-hmm. No, that's no, I'm not making that. It works the other way around. Everything has to be said in order to reach that conclusion, in order to legitimate that conclusion according to this criterion. Obviously, there's a long tradition, both artistic and critical, in the 20th century, of nominating, of making art by nominating things art. But that's not what's at issue here in the art and non-art distinction.
No me refería a eso, me refería a simplemente que el trabajo de crítico es el que aporta que es arte, no el artista por sí solo.
He's just saying that he didn't refer to the sort of artist nominating, but rather to the critical sort of act of nomination.
But it's not a critical act of nomination. It's the conclusion of a laborious demonstration of the critical structure of the work. Critical nomination of art would be a kind of nominal version of aesthetic criticism. It would be like just naming the wow. It would be Greenberg, but instead of saying wow, you'd just say art. Right?
¿Esto se ha entendido bien? Ok. Yo la estoy escuchando ya. Ok.
should I make the question in English better?
No sé si te pueden traducir a la vez, pero hazlo que te escuche bien la traductora, si lo vas a hacer así.
Because my Spanish isn't so good.
Oh, well, definitely
So
English.
it would be the same. Okay. My question has to do, actually, or my problem has to do with the final conclusion, which will be the actualization of the romantic model through the conceptual practice to the contemporary practices. So I'm trying to think of questions that I have about 3 questions that have to do with the talk as a way to think about how could this be brought up to the experience of today's or not. The first is if bad art, if art which is bad or which is not art cannot be criticized, maybe the good art or the art couldn't be criticized either if it has to be romanticized. If the conclusion, through the Benjaminian talk or text, if you romanticize as a form of criticism, if this couldn't be a negation of criticism, and then there wouldn't be a way out to criticism. And the second one has to do with that. So if in this way, couldn't we have not a criticism as above art, but equal as art, side by side, which there's many texts about that to think about criticism as a practice that could be side by side, not after art or not before art, but that could exist as a creative process, which has to do with the romantic model. And then I would think if the romantic model is a pack that you have to buy it all, because there's a lot of the Benjaminian interpretation of this model that was not talked about. So there's Benjamin between the romantics and the conceptual practices. So there are things that could be brought, but things that I wouldn't see in the conceptual works, neither in the contemporary practices. So if you could talk about it, if you can be understood.
Okay, do you want to translate the question?
La traducción la han tenido, ¿no? Yeah, that's fine, because she's got microphones. So that's fine.
Yeah, okay. I'm not sure if I understood the first part of that, but I think you said, well, might not good art be uncriticizable too? I think you said that. Yeah. Well, not on this model, because it would be, that would be an aesthetic model, if you see what I mean, because it would be a model. It would be a model on which the work was complete, yeah, without requiring reflective discursive completion. And if you like, the romantic criticism of the aesthetic model is that the aesthetic model treats works of art as if they are complete, okay, but they are not. In other words, the classical notion of a work is of an organic whole, a harmonious relation between the one and the many. Okay, in a way, the modernity of art is its non-organic structure, and the fragment is one philosophical, critical interpretation of the non-organic character of a work. Now, the distinction between organic and non-organic is, if you like, a deep distinction which is to do with the structure of social experience in modernity, in a sense, because the basic claim that a modern work is non-organic derives from a claim about modernity being characterized by a form of subjectivity which is in a problematic, incomplete relationship to the world. So that it's, if you like, it's the nature of the modern subject which makes art non-organic rather than the critical model. The issue then is, if you like, how do you philosophically conceive the non-organic work, and that the early romantic version is to say we should understand the non-organic work as a fragment. Okay. In terms of the historical, to leap to your last question, come back to the middle one. In terms of the historical movement, obviously one of the things that's going on in Benjamin's recuperation of early romantic criticism, is his finding a philosophical lineage for his understanding of montage, right? Because essentially constructivist montage is the early 20th century version of the collection of fragments. Right? In a sense, there's a historical advance between Romanticism and constructivism in that in the early Romantics, there's a relatively simple conception of the relation between the fragment and collections of fragments. Yeah. Whereas, if you like, montage gives you an account of the internally fractured nature of the work, so that, if you like, fragmentariness is not just that the work as a whole functions as a fragment, right? But insofar as its internal structure is always a structure of montage, its internal structure is a unreconciled relation between two fragments. So that if you like, constructivism and montage deepen the romantic conception of the fragmentariness of the work through the concept of montage. So Benjamin is, if you like, recovering a romantic model of the fragment as the philosophical basis for understanding montage and constructivism and surrealism and the art of his time. Similarly, the same thing applies, if you like, to what it means to read Benjamin. So to read Benjamin's recovery of romanticism in order to understand surrealism and constructivism, becomes the basis for using that to understand the post-formalist art of the 60s, right? Where the relations between elements of works, if you like, is no longer fundamentally, simply based on the notion of montage. Okay, but different kinds of mediating categories of the relation between the fragmentary elements of works come into the understanding of a work. So that the tradition has to be, if you like, updated in relation to the structure of artistic production, the logic of the structure of artistic production at any particular time. And that's the way in which it lives, if you like, not by virtue of a kind of revivalism of an old philosophy, but by virtue of the discovery of new forms of actualization of that philosophy in, if you like, different, more complicated forms of production. So that will only work if you can do that. And that's the point of trying to make it the basis for understanding post-conceptual art. But that's to say how that works is more complicated.
Bien. Si aceptamos tu conclusión, que el arte contemporáneo es necesariamente un arte no conceptual, entonces la estética sería una disciplina muerta. La estética, en términos muy generales, trataría de conceptualizar la experiencia artística. En ese sentido, quería preguntarte si no valdría la pena recuperar una noción de estética débil, o mejor dicho, de estéticas en plural, donde se tenga como pretensión legítima el buscar, digamos, la condición de posibilidad ya no trascendental, sino material de la obra, la relación entre juicios y espectadores, o entre juicios y públicos fuertes, públicos débiles, es decir, tratar de recuperar como una dimensión favorable la pretensión de la estética tradicional, particularmente de la estética clásica alemana. Y bueno, como corolario de esta pregunta sería ver si podrías relacionar la relación que hay entre el crítico con los contextos de recepción. pensar al crítico ya no como un exégeta de la obra o como quien va a evaluarla en un sentido clásico, sino como quien puede hacer una traducción de la obra entre públicos débiles y públicos fuertes, para que la obra no pierda su autonomía, pero al mismo tiempo sea dirigida a un campo mayor de espectadores.
Might want to ask him to clarify sometimes that what he says is that, okay, if we accept your conclusion that contemporary art is basically post-conceptual, then, you know, we could think of aesthetics as a dead discipline. So he was wondering whether you might not want to rather reclaim some kind of weak aesthetics, one that's concerned with the sort of material rather than transcendental conditions of possibility of works of art. And also one that kind of takes account of the difference between weak and strong publics. And in that sense, one that situates the art critic in between these two kinds of publics and somehow mediates between the two.
I mean, the sense in which I claim that it's post-conceptual is twofold in relation to aesthetic. That doesn't mean that there's no post-conceptual art doesn't have no aesthetic dimension. It doesn't make sense for things to have no aesthetic dimension. Okay, insofar as anything has a materiality, it has an aesthetic dimension. Conceptual art was anti-aestheticist in the sense that it contested the aesthetic definition of the work, the reduction of a work to its aesthetic properties. Okay, so it's not that there's no aesthetic. It's that there's, if you like, there's three basic features of its aesthetic, three critical aspects, if you like, of its aesthetic components. The first is the recognition that the aesthetic component is ineliminable. Right? Okay. In other words, there is an aesthetic aspect to anything material. That's the case. But the second is that aesthetic aspect is necessarily inadequate and critically insufficient. Okay. And consequently, as a consequence of the fact that it's necessary but insufficient, it means that the relation to the aesthetic component of a work in a post-conceptual work is generally strategic or instrumental. In other words, the aesthetic becomes a kind of conceptually manipulable element of the work. Yeah. So it's kind of double-coded because it works immediately in its aesthetic immediacy, but it also works critically in relation to its strategic use. I'm not sure I understand the distinction between weak and strong publics. I don't know. Do you mean intellectually weak and strong publics?
Igual haz la pregunta en castellano para que te escuchen los demás, yo se la traduzco en un segundo.
La distinción de Nancy Fraser de público fuerte y público débil. Público débil es aquel basado en que no tiene categorías conceptuales ni estéticas para poder apreciar la obra, pero que tiene una experiencia de la obra. Y el público fuerte es el que ya tiene esa experiencia categorial y al mismo tiempo la experiencia de la obra con la cual puede dialogar, no solo porque no tiene experiencia conceptual, sino porque también la tiene.
This is of Nancy Fraser distinction, that you know, so having the weak public as one that has the experience of the work, but no categorical, not categories with which to judge it. So the strong public as having that sort of categorical distinction. Yeah, it's problematic. But
I don't know. I mean, I maybe I don't like this distinction between weak and strong publics. I don't really think of publics. I mean, I can understand publicity, and I can understand, you know, audiences and constituencies and market segments and different ways of dividing them up. But I think I would want to avoid this distinction between weak and strong publics because I don't think it's of any critical significance. I mean, I think this bears on something else. One of the reasons that art institutions, not art journals or not the programming aspects of, biennales, etc., but institutions and their curatorial programs have a problematic relation to criticism is because they are very much, in this peculiar sort of mix of market, this sort of, the way in which art institutions inhabit a peculiar mix of publicity and market space. Yeah, they become very fixated on what they call their public, but what they actually mean is their market, right? They count a lot of heads. And it goes back to the question of reception. Because they think about their cultural function in relation to reception purely quantitatively, yeah, it completely confuses what their cultural function is, because I think that the quantitative dimension of the people who pass through the doors of the institutions isn't as such relevant to their basic public cultural function. It doesn't really matter if the Tate has Modern has 5 million or 3 million in terms of its public function. It matters in terms of its ability to legitimize itself to sponsors and raise money from governments and make money in the gift shop, but that's not really, it doesn't really bear on its critical public cultural function, I don't think. I think it's irrelevant. I think institutions have become confused by that.
Vale. Igual vamos ya acabando.
Vale. Voy a hacer dos preguntas que tienen que ver más directamente con el arte conceptual. La primera tiene que ver con el rechazo del conceptual a la crítica y quizá a los dos modelos de crítica que has comentado, tanto al modelo de crítica como un juicio, pero también el modelo de crítica como explicación. No sé, por ejemplo, afirmaciones de artistas como Solute, ¿no? En sus párrafos sobre el arte conceptual, donde dice que el artista no es un mono que tiene que ser explicado por el crítico civilizado, ¿no? Que tiene que ver con el problema de la explicación, ¿no? Lo que se supone ser explicado por el otro, ¿no? Mas efectivamente por la figura de lo crítico. Y la segunda pregunta, ¿cómo usted ve la producción de la crítica por artistas, ¿no? O el artista como un crítico, tal cual propone el grupo anglosajón Arte y Lenguas. ¿Y cómo lo ves esto dentro de aquello que usted nombra de historia de la crítica, ¿no? Esta aproximación del artista hacia la crítica, ¿cómo lo ves dentro de la historia de la crítica? ¿Es esto?
Well, his question has to do more directly with conceptual art, and namely with the sort of rejection of conceptual art by rejection of criticism by a conceptual artist, and certainly of the two first models that you propose, art as judgment, criticism as judgment, or criticism as explication. And he was thinking of the paragraphs on conceptual art by Sol Lewitt. That was one part of the question, and the other thing was then, how do you see, in terms of the history of criticism, the role of the artist as critic, and maybe in the sense that art and language would talk of art production as criticism.
Yeah, thanks. I think there's two different issues here. One is to do with there's two different ways in which reasons behind conceptual artists, well, two, maybe three quite different reasons why conceptual artists themselves took on the role of critics as artist critics. I don't think that they rejected criticism per se. They found themselves in a historical situation in which criticism prevailing models of criticism didn't understand what they were doing. So that the first thing was they had to establish the conditions of intelligibility of their own work in order to get it recognized as work in the first place. Yeah, so that they had to take on the critical function on the second model of establishing the conditions of intelligibility, not in order to have the work received in detail, but simply to have the institutions recognize the work as art. Yeah, so there was a kind of practical necessity to that. Having begun to do that, certain conceptual artists, stroke critics, began to see the market advantages of illegitimately transferring artistic authority into the critical domain and attempting to become the authoritative critical determinants of their own work. Obviously, Kossuth is the main example here, right? Where there's, if you like, there's an illegitimate transfer of authority, whereby the implication is that in some sense the artist is like critically privileged, right? But insofar as that happens, that's just a restoration of a bad romantic model of the authority of artistic creativity. In terms of the conceptual model of criticism itself, the artist is the least privileged person in relation to the criticism of their own work. Right? They're the person least able, in some sense, to understand their own work, okay, because of the role that they've played in its production. So, insofar as that basic establishment of the conditions of intelligibility strays into a claim for the authority of criticism on the basis of our artistic production, then that's where things start to go fairly wrong, I think. The art and language claim, the kind of experimental claim that one might treat a theoretical discourse about art as itself an art practice, is slightly different, because that's not really to do with a transfer of authority from artistic production to criticism. It was to do with a sort of quasi-surrealist critical intervention. I mean, that they never made the claim other than that they were experimentally exploring the hypothesis. But it tended to get interpreted, in an immediately literal way. But I take it that they took that to be a kind of polemical claim, yeah, not a literal claim. But that's to get more complicated. But that's different from a related phenomenon which the Sol LeWitt raises, which is the point at which certain kinds of critical writing by artists become art by virtue of their literary qualities, their formal literary qualities. And in that respect, the Sol LeWitt, in a way, the sentences is more important than the paragraphs on conceptual art there. But that's following in a tradition of writers by American artists of the 50s, which was originally pre-conceptual, and particularly in LeWitt's case, it's Ad Reinhardt. Ad Reinhardt is the model for LeWitt's paragraphs and sentences, and obviously Ad Reinhardt didn't consider himself to be a conceptual artist.
Bueno, lo dejamos yo creo aquí hoy y mañana más. Una cosa importante, nos equivocamos en una de las vías de distribución, decía que los seminarios empiezan a las 7:30, imagino que todo el mundo ya tiene claro que es a las 6:30, ¿no? Tratamos de llamar bien. Entonces mañana nos vemos a las 6:30 y quizá empecemos un poquito más puntuales porque también hoy tratamos de esperar un poco a quien llegara rezagado, ¿vale?